Welcome to another edition of the Best Business Minds, where we interview business leaders and academics that write thought-provoking books. I'm Marc Kramer, a serial entrepreneur who consults with family businesses and entrepreneurs. And over the last year, and even today, I'm teaching entrepreneurship at Vinh University in Hanoi, Vietnam. Let's today welcome our guest, Phil Simon, author of The Nine, The Tectonic Forces Reshaping the Workplace. Phil, welcome.
Mark, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to chatting.
Oh, I so enjoyed the book. I love all the research that you did, and I certainly enjoyed your vision of what's going to happen in the future. So let's get started by you telling us about your professional background, how you got to where you are right now.
I drove home from the gym. No, I'm kidding. I have probably the worst background for a quote unquote tech expert. I've went to Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania for undergrad, and then wound up in grad school in Cornell University, got my master's in industrial and labor relations, and started working in human resources, and realized pretty soon that that was probably the worst possible role for me because I had this sort of quantitative and analytical background. They joke at Carnegie Mellon, even the poets know how to code. Oh, then I moved towards HR and payroll systems consulting. And after about 10 years of banging my head against the wall, watching companies screw up different enterprise resource planning implementations, I just started writing. It became my first book. Good things started to happen, and I basically banged out about a book a year over the last 15 years. I no longer do that type of consulting, and I spent 4 years as a college professor before leaving when COVID hit. And these days I help companies get more out of technologies. My last 4 books have all been about the future of work, and my most recent one is called The Nine. But I also work as a ghostwriter and run a small publishing outfit. So let's just say, like you, I wear a few different hats.
Well, maybe we can get you to come to Hanoi, Vietnam and teach at Vinh University because we're launching a master's in AI, and we're going to need more faculty here. So why did you write this book?
It was Toni Morrison, Mark, who said, if the book that you want to read doesn't exist, you have to be the one to write it. It's one of my favorite quotes. And I thought about the changes that were taking place in the workplace and how we weren't going to revert to a pre-COVID world. And I'd already done a lot of research on some of the tools, but I'd say the tipping point for me occurred on November 30th, 2022, when a little tool called ChatGPT version 3.5 dropped. And I immediately said, this is a big deal. And the numbers bore that out. Something like 1 million people signed up in 5 days. That crushed Facebook's record, or the iPhone, in terms of number of customers. And I'd been doing some work ghostwriting a book about digital currencies, so I was familiar with blockchain. And I thought about how a busy executive or a small business owner isn't going to spend the time researching all these trends. And you could write dozens of books about AI or about analytics or blockchain, and many people have, but I was unaware of a book that covered each of the 9 forces that I'm sure we'll talk about shortly, in such a way that a small business owner or a VP or a CXO would go, okay, I know enough now to hopefully prepare for what's coming, or at least be aware of it, because as I write towards the end of the book, you can ignore these forces, but it's kind of like the doctor telling you you need to eat better or exercise more. Ignore it if you want, but good things are probably not going to happen.
Yes, and so that leads us right into, what are the 9 tectonic forces that are altering how we work?
One is employee empowerment, and I'll go quickly. We can unpack them later. The second is dispersion. People aren't working in the office as much. And if you look at the recent spate of companies declining to renew their leases, it's been very interesting watching their actions belie their words. So we want everyone back in the office, but do you want to sign another 10-year lease for the same office space? And the answer is usually no. Inflation, I got that one right. In the book, I predicted that, at least in the US, we would not be reverting to 2% anytime soon. And over the last couple of months, we've seen inflation climb back up to about 3.5%. So I called that one. Automation, artificial AI, particularly Gen AI, and that wasn't a difficult one to get right because I saw its power. Then you have blockchain, immersive technologies like VR and AR. Apple dropped the Vision Pro, I think about 6, 7 months ago, but I knew that was coming because, again, I had done my research. Then you have unhealthy analytics. Basically, companies are using data as a cudgel. to poison the workforce and to possibly get employees to do things that are actually counterproductive. And then finally, fractions. Because of some of the other forces, it's becoming more common for companies to hire a fractional CXO. Part-time employment, as you know, has been around for a long time, but we typically haven't seen it at a senior level. And I do think that based on the other forces, we're going to see more of that. And anecdotally, from what I've seen in LinkedIn, it certainly seems to be a more common job title these days.
Yeah, I think so as well. Have changes from the pandemic where many people, including bosses, like working virtually, or are we going to see us going back to the traditional way because buildings are sitting empty, cities are losing tax revenue, and companies are having a hard time building and maintaining corporate cultures?
Yeah, it's a great point, and the urban doom loop is real. Cities like in the States, New York and San Francisco have seen this rise in remote work, meaning that fewer people come into the office. That in some cases, there's a great Bloomberg article I read probably about 8, 9 months ago about how senior leadership trying to compel employees to return to the workplace isn't so much about culture as it is maintaining tax breaks based upon the percentage of employees who come to the office. So I think that we wind up in a hybrid situation, and I certainly addressed that in some of my previous books. It is, I think, insane to insist that everyone always is in the office to work. The pandemic proved that that doesn't have to be the case. But I think that it's equally insane for an employee to say, I'm never coming in. The muscle memory that it takes an organization, as you know, Mark, to stick the landing on remote and hybrid work takes some time. The companies like Automatic, the company behind WordPress, or 37 Signals, were working in a largely distributed fashion pre-pandemic. So when COVID forced lockdown, not much changed for them. But so much of the logistics of work did shift when we were working remotely, even boring things like, do you have a physical place to work, or do you live with roommates and live in a crowded place or not have fast internet connectivity? So those were big issues. And they also spawned a development movement, a citizen development that I wrote about in my previous book, Low Code, No Code. And all of these things happening, but regardless of what I think, the data has been pretty consistent. Companies want people in the office on average about 3 days per week, at least in the US, and employees are usually willing to come in 2. So to me, it's just a matter of figuring out that sort of zone of agreement. It's not like it's 0 versus 5, because that just doesn't lend itself to compromise. But if it's 3 or 2, or I mean, I think and there was a great 60 Minutes piece on this about 3 months ago, the number of the amount of corporate real estate square footage that's vacant. You're right, not much of that can be repurposed, only about 15%, according to a Columbia professor. So there are going to be big changes in the workplace, and I do think that kind of validates the hypothesis of my book.
Yeah, in fact, I worked with a real estate company that owns properties in like 15 states, and they were able to buy 3 buildings in Georgia that were on the tax rolls for 160 million for 16 million.
Wow.
I mean, you think about that, that's incredible. But they felt like that was a good buy, and they're hoping that, folks are going to come back in. But it turns out that they bought it so inexpensively that if they filled 20% of the building, they would be able to break even. Think about that.
Yeah, and you might see mixed use real estate. So maybe it's a place in which people are working, or you hear about possibly schools or other energy. I mean, the people like Dror Poleg have written extensively about the need for cities to really redefine themselves. What's our purpose? If do you embrace the culture or the events, things that you really can't get the same experience with if you're on a Zoom call like this one?
Yeah, for sure. I can see where accountants, lawyers, and financial planners don't need to collaborate with colleagues to compete because they're essentially their own business with their own clients and P&L. But however, those people don't mind coming to the office as much as people where collaboration is important, like advertising, marketing, new product development. How do you sell people on that? And isn't it more culturally dependent? Because I don't think Asian countries where I live right now have that issue. And in fact, people like the camaraderie that comes with work, going to the workplace.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, but I'd say this, so much hinges on many factors. So you've got the culture, you've got the public transportation system. In the US, we historically have not invested that much in it compared to, say, European countries. So to me, living in Arizona and you've got taxes, gas prices have been high, and one of the forces in the book is inflation. It's a tougher ask to get someone to commute 90 minutes each way. And pre-pandemic, at least in the US, I can't speak about Vietnam or Asia, the average commute was something like 37 minutes. Well, if you get that back just 2 times per week, right, that's 168 minutes. That's a little under 3 hours that you could spend exercising, playing with your kids, walking your dog, reading, whatever you like to do. Another factor you could argue, Mark, is age. So if you're younger, you haven't really built up the social capital. Again, I can't speak about Vietnam or Asia specifically, but in the US, proximity bias is a big deal. I could be working my tuchus off at home and someone else could be slacking off at the office. But because managers see that person at the office and don't see me, they think that I'm not really doing anything, out of sight, out of mind. And Future Forum, which is part of Slack, which was part of Salesforce, which is now no longer an entity, they killed Future Form, I think about a year ago. I did some very interesting research about proximity bias. Long story short, if you're in the office, all things being equal, you are much more likely to get promoted than if you're outside the office. So if you're younger, you haven't really built up that social capital. No one knows who you are. And it's, I think, very difficult, to your point, to build that culture if it's just over Zoom calls or in Slack or Microsoft Teams. So it's just going to be very interesting to see how these things play out. But one size is not going to fit all, where we're seeing companies experiment with different arrangements, whether it's different days of the week or different roles come in at different times, different teams. I mean, it's very difficult to be a security guard if you're working remotely, even part of the time.
Yeah, yeah, that's absolutely true. I actually think that here in Asia, most people have to clock into work. So it's very hard to clock in, and that's because they do want to see the people and make sure that they are working. Uh, and they feel like the collaboration is important. And the other thing I find interesting in Asia is that when you go to offices, they don't even have cubicles. They
Mm.
just have table after table, and people are sitting around like large dining room tables, and they're all over the place, all working literally side by side with no private space whatsoever. And I find it like a little bit surprising because in terms of being able to get work done. Now, in my university, only a few people have offices, so we're typically in cubicles. But a lot of the technology companies, literally, it's like everybody's sitting at the dinner table with their laptop in front of them, and not much. I think they just come in and sit wherever they want to sit that particular day.
Yeah,
Um,
hoteling, as you know, isn't new. And as someone who actually read some of the research on open offices, they correlate very strongly with increased sickness, absenteeism. People get more frustrated because you're having a trying to work and someone next to you is on the phone, but you only hear half the conversation. That's why you've probably seen these. Some companies are actually buying phone booths again. So everything old is new again, just so if you need to have a private conversation, there is some place for you to go versus in the middle of everywhere, which is, again, I don't know about Asia, but in the US, a lot of people consider that rude.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you about hoteling because a major law firm here, Fox Rothschild, has gone to a concept of hoteling where people reserve an office when they need it. On paper, I think that sounds great, but how do partners get to know and teach new associates how to be good lawyers?
Yeah, I'm certainly not an attorney. I only hired one once or twice in my life, and hopefully that number wasn't going to go up. But yeah, there is a lot of informal knowledge that takes place, and you're not going to replicate that if you're at home. So I am a proponent of hybrid work. My 2 books ago, I wrote the one called Project Management in the Hybrid Workplace, and you're right. The notion that some of us are in the office, some of us aren't, poses a lot of challenges. Now, if you're just sitting down to write code and you don't really need to interact with anyone for a couple of days or write marketing copy or do something that requires deep work, to coin the book from Cal Newport, then yeah, you don't go into the office, but there are certain um, elements of work, I would argue, that are best suited for being in person, whether it's bonding events or brainstorming sessions. Again, you can do some of this online, but are you developing the social currency? Are you making an impression, hopefully a good one, with your colleagues? Go back to a couple of questions ago, you were asking about accountants and P&L and all that. I mean, I have met my accountant. It was only over lunch once she took me out, but that means something to me. I'm not sending files for tax season to an amorphous organization or person. So I actually make the recommendation in that book that if you're starting a long-term project, you probably should get together at least once at the kickoff, but ideally at routine points during the project just to check in. It's so much easier, as you know, Mark, to demonize someone over email or on Slack or Microsoft Teams. But if you and I have sat down and shared some war stories like we were doing before about publishing, you're a person. I know you a little bit now. That doesn't mean that I may not disagree with you in the future, or you may not disagree with me. But there's actually a lot of research that I cited in that book about how the closer you are to someone in proximity, the more difficult it is to just lay into them, all things being equal. But we see this online all the time, whether it's places like Reddit or X/Twitter. We don't know someone, it's easier for us to demonize them.
Yeah, in the beginning of the book, you talk about union and employee stoppages, mostly over money. California just raised the minimum wage to $20 an hour. Aren't these publicity stunts since the owners automatically have to raise the price of everything, wiping out the game for employees? Wouldn't it be better if profit sharing was defined and the hourly rate was lower?
I mean, we could talk for a long time about this, but California is a blue state. I can't remember the last time it voted Republican. It might have been 30 years ago. So the voters there tend to lean left. And if you look at the data on productivity versus wage stagnation in the US, the middle class in this country is getting squeezed. Now, yes, all things being equal, if you raise the price of labor in order for a business to continue to make money, then that business would have to increase the price. I read an article in the Wall Street Journal a couple of months ago about how now some restaurants are charging $15 for a hamburger. So there's a lot to unpack there. And there is very much this notion that I cite in the 9 of a wage price spiral. So you are right to the extent that if you raise wages, all things being equal, companies will have to raise prices. But in terms of profit sharing, I'm sure it exists for blue collar workers, but in my experience, you won't find too many chefs or waiters or waitresses who are getting profit sharing.
Yeah, but I think that's the only way to really solve that issue, or because since I was a kid and they keep raising the minimum wage, the workers who need that money, it never catches up. It's like temporary, literally like 6 months, and then all that advantage is wiped out just like
Right.
that.
Well, that's why to me, you still there? You froze a little
Yep,
bit.
yep, yep.
Yeah, that's why to me, automation and AI are so interesting. In the 9, I cite the example of the Fort Worth, Texas McDonald's that only has, I believe, one manager who comes in sometimes to just monitor the equipment. You can place your order and have it prepared exclusively by robots. So I think to your point, inflation, whether it's through natural prices or employees asking for more money or benefits or time off or flexibility vis-a-vis where they work, are driving things like AI and automation. So again, all of these things to me are really connected. And one of the most interesting parts about researching and writing this book was figuring out how these things would